The classroom was alive with chatter, the air thick with the usual morning energy of middle school students who couldn't wait for the bell to ring so they could escape into their usual teenage chaos. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, painting golden streaks across the polished desks, while the sound of sneakers scuffing against the tiled floor filled the room. Then, amidst the casual hum of laughter and gossip, a single sentence sliced through the air, simple yet powerful enough to send the entire class into a fit of laughter. "My dad works at NASA." The words belonged to Oliver Grant, a quiet boy with oversized glasses that always seemed too big for his face. He wasn't the kind to command attention, nor was he the type to boast. In fact, if anything, Oliver was the kid who blended into the background, the one whose name teachers often forgot until they checked the attendance sheet. But the moment he said those 5 words, the entire classroom erupted. Some students chuckled under their breath, others exchanged amused glances, and then there were those who outright burst into laughter as if Oliver had just cracked the joke of the year. Among them was Jason, the self-proclaimed leader of the classroom, whose smirk grew wider as he leaned forward on his desk, eyes glinting with amusement. "Your dad works at NASA?" Jason scoffed. "Yeah, sure. And my uncle is the president." The laughter grew louder. A few kids even clapped their hands together as if Jason had just delivered a punchline worthy of a comedy show. Oliver's ears turned red and he gripped his pencil tightly, his knuckles white. He had expected skepticism, maybe a few raised eyebrows, but this was humiliating. "I'm serious," Oliver muttered, though his voice barely carried over the ruckus. Jason wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he threw out another jab. "Right? So what does he do? Build spaceships in his garage? Or maybe he just presses buttons and pretends to launch rockets?" More laughter. Even Mrs. Donovan, their teacher, seemed unsure of how to react. She adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "All right, class, settle down. Let's show some respect." But the damage was already done. The moment had passed, and Oliver knew that for the rest of the day, maybe even the rest of the school year, he would be the kid who thought his dad was a NASA scientist. A liar. A dreamer. Someone to mock. The bell rang, signaling the start of the lesson, but Oliver could barely focus. His heart pounded, his hands clenched at his sides. He knew his father was incredible. He knew his words were true. But in that moment, with all eyes on him, he wished he had never spoken at all. The day dragged on, and the whispers never stopped. At lunch, Oliver sat alone at the farthest table, pushing his food around his plate while the rest of the cafeteria buzzed with energy. A few kids pointed in his direction, their laughter echoing even over the chaotic clatter of trays and silverware. "Maybe his dad just cleans the floors at NASA," someone shouted from across the room. Oliver's stomach twisted, but he kept his head down. He didn't need to prove anything to them. He didn't need validation. Or at least that's what he tried to tell himself. But the doubt crept in anyway. When he got home that evening, his father, Mark Grant, was sitting at the kitchen table. His laptop open, formulas and star charts sprawled across the screen. The glow of the computer reflected in his sharp blue eyes, the same eyes Oliver had inherited. His father was brilliant, a man who spent his life working on projects that most people could only dream of. But suddenly, all Oliver could see was the laughter, the mockery. "Hey kiddo, how was school?" Mark asked, glancing up from his screen. Oliver hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine." His father studied him for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "That doesn't sound like fine to me." Oliver sat down, staring at the table. "I told them about you today. About NASA." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And?" Oliver let out a bitter laugh. "They think I'm lying. They laughed at me." For a moment Mark said nothing. Then, without warning, he closed his laptop and stood up. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Something firm, unwavering. "All right," Mark said. "Looks like it's time to pay your school a little visit." Oliver's eyes widened. "Wait, what? You don't have to." "Oh, I do." Mark's lips twitched into a small smile. "After all, I can't have my son's classmates thinking he's a liar, can I?" Oliver wasn't sure whether to be excited or terrified. But one thing was certain, by tomorrow, everything was about to change. The next morning, Oliver sat at his desk, stomach twisted in knots. He hadn't told anyone that his dad was coming. The thought of Mark Grant walking into the classroom, into his world, made his palms sweat. What if his father was too formal, Too technical? What if he walked in, rattled off a bunch of science jargon, and gave Jason and the others even more reason to laugh? No, this was a mistake. He should have told his dad to forget it. Should have kept his mouth shut. But it was too late for regrets. The moment the first bell rang, Mrs. Donovan walked in with her usual stack of lesson plans and the same tired look she always wore on Monday mornings. She set her things down, adjusted her glasses, and cleared her throat. All right, class. Before we begin today's lesson, we have a special guest. Oliver's breath caught in his throat. The class murmured, confused. A few kids glanced at each other. Jason, ever the loudmouth, leaned back in his chair. Oh, this should be good. Then the door opened, and Mark Grant stepped inside. First, there was silence. The kind of silence that only happens when a room full of teenagers is caught off guard. Mark wasn't wearing a suit or a lab coat. Nothing that screamed, scientist or NASA genius. Instead, he wore a simple button-down shirt, dark jeans, and the calm, confident expression of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room before settling on Oliver, giving him the smallest of nods. Good morning, everyone, Mark said, his voice steady but warm. My name is Mark Grant. I'm an aerospace engineer at NASA. Whispers rippled through the classroom. Jason blinked. His usual smirk faltered, just a little. Mrs. Donovan smiled. Thank you for coming, Mr. Grant. Oliver mentioned that you work in aerospace. We'd love to hear about what you do. Mark nodded. He clasped his hands together, taking a moment before speaking. You know, when I was your age, I used to sit in a classroom just like this, staring out the window, dreaming about space. I never thought I'd actually get to work on missions that send people beyond our planet. But here's the thing, NASA isn't just about astronauts. It's about engineers, programmers, scientists, and dreamers who take the impossible and turn it into reality. A few students leaned in, listening now. Jason, however, rolled his eyes. Yeah, sure. But what do you actually do? Mark turned to him without missing a beat. Good question. I help design propulsion systems for spacecraft. Right now, my team is working on next-generation rockets that could one day take us to Mars. The room went still. Even Jason, for once, had no comeback. Mrs. Donovan's eyebrows lifted. Mars. Mark nodded. That's right. The Artemis program is laying the groundwork for future exploration beyond the moon. It's not just science fiction anymore. It's happening. And people like me, people like Oliver, are the next generation who'll push us even further. Oliver's face burned. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected his father to mention him. Jason scoffed. Yeah, okay. So you make rockets. But do you actually fly them? Or are you just some guy in an office? A few kids chuckled, but Mark only smiled. No, I don't fly them, he admitted. But without my team, those rockets wouldn't get off the ground in the first place. You see, space travel isn't just about astronauts. It's about the thousands of people working behind the scenes, making sure every calculation is perfect, every piece of equipment is tested, and every mission is safe. One mistake, one decimal point in the wrong place could mean failure. That's why what we do matters. Jason crossed his arms, but he wasn't laughing anymore. For the first time, the classroom was silent, not out of boredom, but out of awe. Oliver watched as his father pulled something from his pocket, a small silver NASA pin. This, Mark said, holding it up, was given to me after my first successful project. It's not much, just a pin. But to me, it represents years of hard work. The kind of work that takes patience, skill, and yes, sometimes getting laughed at because people don't believe in your dreams. His eyes flickered toward Oliver just for a second. But here's the thing about science, Mark continued. It doesn't care if people believe in it or not. It just is. The weight of his words settled over the room. Even Jason seemed unsure of himself now. Mrs. Donovan smiled. That was incredible, Mr. Grant. I think we all learned something today. But Mark wasn't finished. Actually, I was hoping to show you all something special. He reached into his bag and pulled out a sleek, black tablet. The screen flickered to life, displaying an image of a rocket, one that looked unlike anything most of them had seen before. This is the project I'm currently working on, he said. And if you're interested, I can take you all on a virtual tour of what it takes to send something like this into space. The class erupted, not with laughter this time, but with excitement. And for the first time, Oliver saw something he never thought he'd see. Jason, leaning forward in his chair, eyes wide with curiosity. The room was buzzing with excitement. A few kids murmured to each other, others craned their necks to get a better view of Mark's tablet. Even Mrs. Donovan, who usually had to force the class into paying attention, looked genuinely intrigued. But Oliver wasn't watching them, he was watching Jason. For the first time, the usual smirk was gone. Jason was leaning forward slightly, his brows furrowed, his mouth pressed into a thin line. It was the look of someone who wanted to act unimpressed but couldn't quite pull it off. Mark tapped the screen, and the image on the tablet expanded, revealing a sleek spacecraft against the backdrop of space. "This is the Orion capsule," Mark said. "It's designed for deep space missions and will be a part of NASA's efforts to return to the moon and eventually go to Mars." A few students let out low whistles. "You mean people are actually gonna live in that?" a boy named Diego asked. Mark nodded. "That's right. And not just for a short trip either. Future astronauts might have to spend months, maybe even years, traveling through space. That's why every single part of this design has to be tested over and over again. If something goes wrong when they're thousands of miles away from Earth, there's no easy way to fix it." Jason scoffed, though it didn't carry the same confidence as before. "Yeah, but don't rockets always explode? Seems like a bad job if everything just blows up all the time." A few kids laughed, but Mark smiled, unfazed. "That's a common misconception," he said. "Explosions do happen, but not as often as movies make it seem. And every failure teaches us something. That's how science works. We push the limits, we make mistakes, and we learn from them." The Apollo program had failures before landing on the moon. SpaceX had rockets crash before successfully landing them. And when things go wrong, it's not the astronauts or the machines that figure out how to fix it, it's the engineers. Jason fell silent. Mark let the moment hang before continuing. "Now here's something really cool." He swiped to another image, this time a simulation of a spacecraft docking onto a space station. The screen was filled with complex diagrams, data charts, and controls. This is what astronauts train with before they go into space. It's called a docking simulator. The goal is to carefully align the spacecraft with the station and attach it without crashing. The class murmured in awe. "And I thought parallel parking was hard," someone joked. Mark chuckled. "It's a lot like that, actually. Just imagine trying to park a car in zero gravity while traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. "Nope," Diego muttered. "I just stay on Earth." More laughter. But this time it wasn't directed at Oliver. It wasn't at his expense. Mark glanced at Mrs. Donovan. "Would you mind if I let the students try it out?" She blinked. "Wait, you mean right now?" "Of course. I have a training module loaded onto this tablet. It's the same type of simulation real astronauts use, just simplified. I'll let them take turns and see if they can successfully dock a spacecraft." The class erupted. Everyone was suddenly on the edge of their seats, hands shooting into the air. Even the kids who usually tuned out during science lessons were now desperate to participate. Oliver, still processing everything, watched as Mark handed the tablet to Mrs. Donovan, who placed it on her desk. "All right," she said, smiling. "Who wants to go first?" Before anyone could respond, Jason stood up. "I'll do it," he said. The room quieted slightly, the energy shifting. Oliver clenched his fists under the desk. He knew what Jason was doing, trying to take control of the moment, to show off in front of everyone. If he succeeded, he'd walk away acting like it was no big deal. If he failed, he'd find a way to turn it into a joke. Mark handed him the tablet. "All right, Jason. Let's see what you've got." Jason cracked his knuckles, then gripped the tablet with both hands. The simulator booted up, displaying a spacecraft floating in space with a small space station in the distance. A set of digital controls appeared: thrust, rotation, speed adjustments. "Your goal," Mark explained, "is to carefully guide the spacecraft toward the docking port without crashing. Take it slow. Precision is more important than speed." Jason nodded, his usual cockiness still present. "Easy." He tapped the thrusters, sending the spacecraft forward. The students around him watched with anticipation. For the first few seconds, he seemed to be doing fine. The spacecraft drifted closer to the station, the numbers on the screen tracking his speed and angle. Then he overcorrected. The spacecraft tilted too much to the left. Jason swiped too hard in the opposite direction, and the ship began spinning uncontrollably. "Oh, Wait, hold on, He struggled to regain control, but the simulator wasn't forgiving. A red warning flashed on the screen. "Crash." Mission failed. The class burst into laughter. Jason's face turned red. Stupid game, he muttered, shoving the tablet back toward Mark. Mark, however, simply smiled. Not as easy as it looks, huh? Jason scowled but said nothing. Mrs. Donovan clapped her hands. All right, who wants to try next? Oliver hesitated for only a moment before raising his hand. This time, when Jason looked at him, there was no laughter. No smirk. Only silent, simmering frustration. Oliver felt his heartbeat quicken as Mark handed him the tablet. Every eye in the room was on him now. Jason was watching, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Take your time, Mark said softly. Oliver nodded, gripping the tablet carefully. The screen displayed the same setup, his spacecraft floating in the void of space, the docking station in the distance. The controls were simple enough. Small thrusts forward, adjustments for pitch and roll, and careful alignment with the docking port. He took a slow breath. Jason had failed because he was too aggressive with the controls. Oliver knew that space was about precision, not force. He tapped the thruster lightly, just a small push forward. The spacecraft inched toward the station. The class was unusually silent. Even the kids who usually tuned out were watching intently. He adjusted the pitch just slightly. The docking port lined up in his sights. A few whispers broke out behind him. He's actually doing it. No way. He's way better than Jason. Oliver swallowed the lump in his throat, keeping his focus on the screen. His fingers moved carefully, steady. The distance counter ticked down. 10 meters. 5 meters. 2 meters. A soft chime rang out from the tablet. Successful docking. Mission complete. The class erupted. Oliver exhaled in relief, realizing he had been holding his breath. No way! Someone shouted. That was awesome. Jason, still seated, was frozen. His mouth opened as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Mark chuckled, clapping a hand on Oliver's shoulder. Great job. You've got a steady hand. That's exactly the kind of skill real astronauts need. Oliver felt warmth spread through his chest. For once, he wasn't the kid getting laughed at. He wasn't the target of Jason's jokes. He was the kid who had just pulled off something incredible. Mrs. Donovan smiled. I think we have a future aerospace engineer in our class. Jason scoffed, pushing himself up from his chair. Yeah, whatever. It's just a dumb game. Mark turned to him, his expression unreadable. Actually, Jason, this is a real NASA training module. What Oliver just did. It's something that astronauts practice over and over again before they ever go to space. And you know what? Most people fail on their first few tries. Takes patience. Takes skill. It takes the ability to learn from mistakes. Jason's face darkened. Whatever. Before anyone could say more, Mark glanced at Mrs. Donovan. If it's all right, I have one more thing to show the class. She nodded. Please go ahead. Mark set the tablet down and reached into his bag, pulling out a sleek, silver briefcase. He placed it on Mrs. Donovan's desk, unlatched it and opened it. Inside was something that made the entire class lean in. A real NASA flight helmet. Polished, futuristic, the kind of thing you only saw in movies. Gasps filled the room. This, Mark said, lifting it carefully, is the same kind of helmet worn by astronauts when they train for spacewalks. It's engineered to withstand the extreme conditions of space. Vacuum, radiation, extreme temperatures. Jason, despite himself, stared. I brought this because I wanted you all to see something real, Mark continued. A lot of people think NASA is just about astronauts floating in zero gravity. But it's more than that. It's a place where science fiction becomes reality. Where impossible things happen because people like me, and one day people like you, make them happen. He paused, glancing around the room. And if any of you think this is something you might want to be a part of, engineering, space travel, exploration, remember this, it doesn't matter where you start. It doesn't matter if people laugh at you, or if they don't believe in you. What matters is that you believe in yourself. Oliver's chest tightened. He saw Jason shift uncomfortably. For once, Jason wasn't the one controlling the room. Mark set the helmet down. All right, who wants to try it on? The classroom erupted in excitement once more. And as students crowded forward, eager to get a glimpse of something real, Oliver caught Jason's expression. Frustration. But also, just for a second, something that looked an awful lot like doubt. As the excited buzz filled the room, Oliver took a step back, watching his classmates eagerly line up to get a chance to try on the NASA flight helmet. Even kids who barely paid attention in class were pushing forward, desperate to be part of the moment. Jason, however, stood frozen near his desk. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his jaw tight. He wasn't smirking anymore. In fact, he looked like he was struggling with something. Mark noticed. "Hey, Jason," he called out casually. "You want to try it on?" The entire class turned to look at Jason. For a brief second, Oliver almost felt bad for him. He knew what it was like to be put on the spot, to feel like all eyes were waiting for him to fail. Jason hesitated, then shook his head. "Nah, not interested." Mark didn't seem surprised. He nodded, placing the helmet down gently. "That's all right. Space isn't for everyone." The class continued passing the helmet around, kids marveling at its weight and design. Some took selfies, others inspected the fine details. The excitement in the room was undeniable. But Oliver's mind wasn't on the helmet anymore. It was on Jason. He knew this wasn't just about NASA or space. It was about something deeper, something Jason wasn't ready to admit. As the excitement began to settle, Mark checked his watch. "All right, before I go, I want to leave you all with something." The class quieted down. You all laughed when Oliver said his dad worked at NASA, he said, his tone calm but firm. "That's okay. I get it. Sometimes, when we don't understand something, it's easy to dismiss it. But I want you to think about this. The things that seem impossible today? They're only impossible because you haven't seen them happen yet. Asterisk. The room was silent now. Think about it. 100 years ago, people thought landing on the moon was crazy. Today, we're planning to send humans to Mars. A few decades ago, people laughed at the idea of reusable rockets. Now they're landing themselves on ships in the ocean. So next time someone tells you something that sounds unbelievable, maybe don't laugh. Maybe ask how. Oliver felt a lump in his throat. Jason shifted uncomfortably. Mark smiled. And who knows? Maybe one day, one of you will be the one making the impossible happen. Mrs. Donovan clapped, breaking the moment. Thank you so much for coming in today, Mark. This was incredible. The class erupted into cheers. Even the kids who usually acted too cool to care were clapping. Mark gave a small, appreciative nod. He packed up his briefcase, gave Oliver a wink, and turned to leave. But as he reached the door, Jason suddenly called out. Wait. Everyone turned. Jason swallowed, looking like he hated what he was about to say. So, your dad really works at NASA? Oliver met his eyes. There was no mockery in his voice this time. No sarcasm. Just uncertainty. Oliver nodded. Yeah. Jason hesitated. Then, to everyone's surprise, he muttered, That's kinda cool, I guess. A stunned silence followed. Then Diego laughed. Dude, just admit it. You're impressed. Jason scowled. Shut up, Diego. But this time, when the class laughed, it wasn't at Oliver. It was just a regular, lighthearted laugh, one that didn't carry the weight of cruelty. And for the first time in a long time, Oliver felt something shift. Jason wasn't his friend. He probably never would be. But the next time he walked into class, Oliver knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't be the joke anymore.